So we're going to start with another interesting tie-in, which is kind of a testament to the footprint that is Hicks and Company. There were three in the previous panel who have some connections with Hicks and Company. Brad Jones is a former employee, Brittany McLean, and Brandon Young is a current employee there. I am a former Hicks and Company employee, and our next presenter, Sergio Iruejas, is also a former Hicks and Company employee. So, and then tomorrow there are going to be a couple other folks who have some history with that company. So it's kind of amazing to see these sorts of connections between professions and things like that. So with that, I think let's go ahead and present Sergio's video. He's going to be talking a little bit about the legal context that surrounds cemeteries and cemetery management. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and let her roll.
Hello. Thank you all for attending the City of Austin's All Together Here Symposium. My name is Sergio Iruegas, and I'm the President and Cultural Resources Director of GTI Environmental LLC. I am a qualified professional archaeologist with over 34 years of experience. Federal agencies and project sponsors seek my expertise in some part because I meet the legal requirements to serve as an expert consultant and an expert witness, as well as our firm's ability to successfully complete projects. What we will discuss today is the same information I have taught in Continuing Legal Education International LLC coursework for lawyers concerning cemetery laws. We base our presentation on years of experience working with state historic preservation offices and demonstrating compliance with federal and state historic preservation laws. In that capacity, I have made federal and state project review decisions on a daily basis about the regulatory processes and serving as an expert consultant with a federal judge in an arbitration case between a municipality and lineal descendants. In conjunction, we will discuss some examples of how we have demonstrated respect in the context of historic Hispanic and indigenous burials and burial grounds. For purposes of this discussion, we are dealing with the concepts of known and unknown cemeteries, and we do not talk about the definitions of abandoned and unverified cemeteries covered under Title 13, Chapter 22 of the Texas Administrative Code, because these definitions are predicated on the consultant's ability to conduct an appropriate archival research. Professional archaeology consultants not only have to guide the project sponsor through the end of the regulatory process of obtaining and completing an exhumation permit under the Antiquities Code of Texas, the consultant has to accomplish several key tasks prior to disturbing the ground. To avoid issues of controversy, demonstrating respect includes completing an archaeological intensive survey based on a research design that considers an appropriate archival level of effort and identifying unmarked burials outside or within modern-day cemetery boundaries. A monitoring permit is only appropriate, quote, during or after other phases of archaeological investigation, end quote. If a professional archaeological survey has not been completed in the past, then an archaeological monitoring permit is inappropriate as a beginning phase of investigation. During the latter 19th century, municipalities circumscribed, segregated, and separate burial grounds in a modern fenced boundary area according to early 20th century cemetery legal requirements. Archival research should include information about individuals interred in the family graveyard within a project area. Consultants can obtain this archival data from the historic deed records. Historic town records also document individuals' names in community graveyards. Certainly a tombstone or a marker with the individual's name identifies the grave as a known cemetery. The definition of identified grave, however, also includes, quote, other evidence of the name of the individual interred in the grave, end quote, such as a list of the names in the family graveyard or community graveyard manifest. Notices in local newspapers for 6 weeks soliciting responses from the general public may not sufficiently demonstrate compliance with cemetery laws. Quote, when removal of the remains is requested during a project with an antiquities permit under Chapter 26 of this title, and under the jurisdiction of the Health and Safety Code of Texas, graves must be removed under the procedures described in Part 711.0105, end quote. In cases where historic burial records identify a grave, there may not be a surviving spouse, children, parents, or siblings. Therefore, in these cases, quote, remains interred in the cemetery may be removed from a plot in the cemetery with the written consent of the adult person in the next degree of kinship, end quote. The consultant should inform the project sponsor of the nexus that potentially makes the project a federal undertaking and subject to the review and approval of a federal agency. The Memorandum of Agreement between the Texas Natural Resources Conservation Commission and the Environmental Protection Agency under Region 6 concerning the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System requires the project sponsor to inform the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, formerly known as TNRCC, of burials associated with historic cemeteries. The project sponsor should inform TCEQ prior to or at the same time as the filing of a notice of intent for stormwater discharge associated with the construction activity under the TPDES general permit, which are delegated EPA National Pollution Elimination System federal permits. Based on the appropriate archival research, consultants should consider if any individuals in historic burial records are foreign nationals. In these cases, the U.S. Department of State has jurisdiction under the agreement between the government of the United States of America and the government of the French Republic. In the agreement, the Department of State will consider its jurisdiction regarding the removal of foreign nationals' human remains on a case-by-case basis in consultation with the host government. In 1986, the Texas Historical Commission established this precedent based on the agency's demonstration of respect and compliance with the Health and Safety Code of Texas's requirement to obtain written consent from the next of kin. When the agency excavated the La Belle shipwreck, the agency archaeologists discovered the human remains of a French colonist. The agency conducted an appropriate archival level of effort at repositories in France and conducted DNA studies to identify the next of kin prior to the removal of the human remains. In 1984, the city of San Antonio consulted and obtained written consent from the direct lineal descendants of the Spanish impresario Benjamin Milam before removing his human remains. When it comes to historic Coahuilteco, Hispanic, Tejano, or Mexican-American burials, it's important that the exhumation permit include a research design that incorporates traditional mortuary practices of these groups. Our peoples have shared cultural heritage. For instance, the Native and Tejano cultures both buried ceremonial caches of beads, or rosaries, which included beads small enough to fall through traditional quarter-inch wire mesh. The permit excavation methodology should include screening all excavated materials through secondary screening processes using window screen to demonstrate respect to the cultural groups. In many cases during the 18th century, ethnohistoric records reveal how priests debated whether it was appropriate to bury someone in a sanctified burial ground, and the ecclesiastical position was to bury apostates just outside the graveyard boundary. With cultural sensitive archival research, a well-qualified professional can discern these issues, and next of kin sometimes give written consent to remove their ancestors for reburial within the historic boundary of the graveyard for the eternal rest of their relatives. In closing, the presentation contributes one last aspect of these types of processes. The Rules of Practice and Procedure of the Antiquities Code of Texas and the Council of Texas Archaeologists do not have an archival format report outline. Therefore, we recommend following historic documentation requirements under the Secretary of the Interior Standards and Guidelines as a demonstration for that level of respect in archival research reports.
Hey there. So we're back. Sergio, thank you very much for putting together that video. And it was a good kind of overview of the sort of the legal framework of cemeteries and things like that. And I had a follow-up question for you. In your video, you mentioned how a lot of Tejano and Hispanic groups share many of the material cultures and the traditions, mortuary traditions of Native Americans. And you talked about the caches of beads and that sort of a thing. I was wondering if you knew of or had past examples or past experience with other commonalities like that between those groups. And also, more importantly, why is that? Why are those connections?
So the reason there are connections is because the majority of the Hispanic community can trace their lineal descent back to the earliest mission Indians and earlier. So, for instance, William Newcomb Jr. told us in 1961 in his assessment of the indigenous cultures of Texas that mortuary practices included burying caches of beads that used to belong to the deceased individuals. That particular practice was evolved and transferred to the intermeshed and intermixed cultural group that became the Tejano, the combination of the Cobolteco and Spanish. And that became partly being buried with rosaries. And so with the excavation method using window screens, we have discovered that you can find actual rosaries. We have not excavated a burial where we found rosaries, but we have excavated cultural material areas in a historic yardscape where a rosary was found, rosary beads.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much. What I want to do now is we're going to kind of transition over to, we're going to talk with Dwayne Peter, who is another prominent archaeologist in the region, and he played a very key role in the excavations of a significant African-American cemetery in Dallas, the Freedman Cemetery. And so what we'll do is we'll go ahead and run the video now, and we'll talk to Dwayne briefly after that.
Hello, my name is Doug Boyd, and I'm an archaeologist with Cox McLean Environmental Consulting. I'm going to share my screen now and begin my presentation. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the Oakwood Symposium and talk to you about the Pioneer Cemetery Archaeological Project. This project involves a large African-American cemetery that was impacted by a state highway road expansion project in the town of Brazoria in Brazoria County. Brazoria County is situated along the Texas coast at the mouth of the Brazos River. The lower reaches of the Brazos River bottomlands were well suited for agriculture. The reality of plantation life and a slave-based economy sets the stage for understanding the Pioneer Cemetery. State Highway 332 was originally constructed in 1939 to 1940, and it crosses over the Brazos River just north of the Pioneer Cemetery. At the time, the road ran along what the Highway Department believed to be the west edge of the Pioneer Cemetery, which was a segregated burial ground for African Americans in Brazoria. As we will see, the highway was actually built over the edge of the cemetery. About 5 blocks northwest is the old Brazoria Cemetery, which is where the white citizens of Brazoria were buried. The lots that make up the cemetery were sold to African American churches between 1888 and 1891. However, it is likely that this city block was already a well-established burial ground for the Black community long before these land purchases occurred. When you look around the cemetery today, what strikes you is that there are only a handful of marked graves with lots of space in between. Members of the Pioneer Cemetery Association believe that this cemetery contains hundreds of unmarked graves. The Pioneer Cemetery Archaeological Project began when Texas Department of Transportation was planning to expand the state highway road. They knew there could be unmarked graves along the right-of-way, so TxDOT hired archaeological consultants to do most of the archaeological investigations, and they provided all of the funding for the work. Archaeologists from Pruitt & Associates, which merged with Cox McLean Environmental earlier this year, conducted most of the grave searches and all of the grave excavations and bioarchaeological analyses. We coordinated our work with all of the other interested parties, including the Pioneer Cemetery Association. Field work was conducted intermittently from 1999 through to 2010. The archaeological work consisted of excavations, mechanical excavations, stripping to search for unmarked graves east of the cemetery. This 2018 aerial photograph shows the location of the fenced area of Pioneer Cemetery and the expanded SH 332 roadway. A large area west of the cemetery, about 3/4 of an acre, was completely excavated in the mechanical searches between 1999 and 2010. The excavations were all inside the highway right-of-way. TxDOT archaeologists conducted the first Gradall scraping in 1999, and they discovered 5 unmarked grave shafts in a relatively small search area. In 2003, Pruitt & Associates archaeologists excavated 3 of these burials. 2 of the graves were close enough to the cemetery fence that TxDOT decided they should be left in place. 5 years later, we returned to Pioneer Cemetery to conduct the mechanical search for unmarked graves. This was done in phases with additional mechanical excavations in 2008, 2009, and 2010. We discovered and excavated 11 more unmarked graves, bringing the total number of exhumed burials to 14. This photograph shows the machine scraping in 2009, which began after TxDOT removed the pavement of the northbound lane of SH 332. The old highway bridge over the Brazos River is visible in the background. In order to complete the archaeological work quickly and help TxDOT keep its road project on schedule, we often had 2 Gradalls digging simultaneously, with an archaeologist monitoring each one. All of the excavations went at least 6 to 10 feet deep so that we could be sure that we were not missing any unmarked graves. This map shows the locations of 14 unmarked graves that were discovered and excavated west of the cemetery fence. 8 of these graves were found underneath the pavement of the northbound lane of old SH 332. It is assumed that these graves were not marked in 1939 to 1940 when the highway was built. The preservation of burial remains varied, but was generally good. This is a photo of Burial 7 showing the intact wooden platform called a grave arch that was present in some burials just above the coffins. Once the remains were removed from the ground, they were taken to a secure laboratory for analysis and then stored in reburial boxes to await reinterment. All of the burial remains were analyzed by an osteologist who identified the person's age, sex, and made observations regarding general health and physical and pathological conditions. The 14 burials included 9 adults and 5 infants and children. As was common in many populations, the 19th and 20th centuries, infant deaths were high. This graph looks at the age of death data for large burial populations from 2 African-American cemeteries dating to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Both populations had a very high infant mortality, a fairly good survival rate for older children and young adults, and then the mortality rate increased again for adults over 35. We see the same distribution for the 13 Pioneer Cemetery burials where we could get a reliable age estimate. The skeletal evidence revealed that the adults had done hard physical labor for most of their lives. This is a sample of the coffin hardware from the Pioneer Cemetery burials. These items were identified and dated by comparing them with published illustrations in 19th and 20th century coffin hardware catalogs. All of these coffin hardware items were in common use from the 1860s to the 1880s. This image shows some of the personal items that were found with the burials. Although we did not know the names of any of these people, these types of personal items revealed something about each person. The small buttons and gold baby bib pin was an especially poignant reminder that each deceased person was cherished by their family. Burial 9 was a 35 to 59-year-old of an indeterminate sex. This individual had an amputated right leg that was replaced with a prosthetic leg. The prosthesis probably had wood and leather parts that deteriorated, leaving behind only the badly rusted iron pieces. The project received a lot of media attention, but most of the public outreach occurred just prior to and during 2 reinterment ceremonies. The remains of 3 exhumed individuals were laid to rest on April 4th, 2003. We collaborated with all the interested parties to help plan and conduct this reburial. The second reinterment ceremony was held on September 12th, 2012, and the remains of 11 individuals were laid back to rest. TxDOT did most of the planning and coordination for this event, and it was well attended by members of the community. TxDOT installed new grave markers for both of the reburial plots. The markers of the graves note that these unidentified individuals were moved during the roadway expansion. TxDOT is in the business of building and maintaining roads, so they end up dealing with more historic cemeteries than does any other agency in Texas. Pioneer Cemetery is just one example of the kinds of projects that they do regularly. As they did for Pioneer Cemetery, TxDOT tries to be proactive in anticipating when road projects might impact historic graves or cemeteries. In cases where the impacts cannot be avoided, TxDOT takes every step possible to make sure that historic graves are found, exhumed in a respectful manner, and relocated to an appropriate place. 2 archaeological reports have been published on this project, and they are available to the public. The 2016 report was dedicated to the African American community of Brazoria County, as was noted in the following statement. The full story of the many generations of enslaved Blacks and freedmen who lived and died there in the 19th and 20th centuries has yet to be fully told. It is hoped that the African American community will ultimately benefit from what has been learned in this bioarchaeological research, and that this report contributes to the history of the people whose remains are buried at Pioneer Cemetery and to the greater story of the African diaspora in Texas. I will conclude with a big thank you to everyone involved in the Pioneer Cemetery project, and thank you to everyone who is participating in this Oakwood Cemetery Symposium.
Well, for those of you who don't know, who aren't in the industry, one of the great things about Dwayne Peter is that he does an excellent impression of Doug Boyd. No, that was, we ran the video for Doug Boyd, who is with Cox McLean, formerly with Pruitt and Associates, and he was talking about the Pioneer Cemetery in Southeast Texas. And so if we can bring up Doug, if you're available, I have a quick follow-up question to your presentation. There's Sergio. Well, we can move, I'll tell you what we can do is let's move on. Let's go ahead and run the video for Dwayne Peter, his video on the Freedman Cemetery in Dallas. We can talk about that one next.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to participate in this symposium sponsored by the City of Austin. I am honored to present my perspective regarding public involvement and outreach for projects that impact historic cemeteries. My perspective reflects my experience in directing a talented team that analyzed and told the story of Freedman's Town in Dallas, Texas, and 40 years of experience interacting with communities underrepresented in history and prehistory. In the late 1990s, the Texas Department of Transportation faced several challenges in moving a large portion of Freedman Cemetery out of the path of North Central Expressway in Dallas, Texas. It was only through the efforts of the Texas Department of Transportation that many people realized that there was an African American cemetery there in the path of the North Central Expressway. One of the challenges that they faced at that time was responding to the African American descendant population who wanted greater involvement in the direction of the project. Key TxDOT personnel, Ms. Diana Noble, Ms. Ann Irwin, and Dr. Nancy Kenmatsu, and a geomarine team were determined to address this challenge in a manner that provided the African American community with a strong voice. Geomarine proposed public involvement in the form of an attic fair, a steering committee that reflected the perspective of the African American community, and a major exhibit at the African American Museum. The result was giving voice to a late 19th, early 20th century African American community represented by the 1,150 burials that were moved. The Freedman Cemetery project adopted a multidisciplinary approach using an ethnically diverse scientific team to conduct a holistic, in-depth study of 19th century African-American urban life. The research team consisted of the following: a steering committee, historians, archaeologists, ethnographers, human osteologists. Results of the study were presented in a comprehensive technical report, educational materials, and a museum exhibit. The steering committee provided essential guidance concerning the production of a history that reflected the perspective of the local African American community, not just that of the larger society. The steering committee consisted of Dr. Robert Prince, a local historian and member of the descendant community, Dr. Maria Franklin, professor of anthropology and history at the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. Lewis Williams, professor of history at Prairie View A&M, Ms. Sonia Ramsey, then a PhD candidate in United States history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and of course, Dr. Harry Robinson, director of the Dallas African American Museum, and Mr. Philip Collins, art curator of the Dallas African American Museum. Last but not least, Mamie McKnight, director of Black Dallas Remembered, was part of this steering group. These people all provided their expertise and their cultural perspective. The steering committee was responsible for determining the direction of the project and the means of encouraging public involvement. Public involvement and outreach were achieved through the following: an attic fair, a project logo contest, an educational curriculum, brochures, a poster, and last but not least, a major museum exhibit. The project was kicked off with the Attic Fair sponsored by the African American Museum. The Attic Fair was designed to solicit artifacts, memorabilia, and oral histories from the descendant community. The means of reaching out to the community included radio spots and local stations, newspaper ads, and good old-fashioned social networking. The museum made certain that all African American churches in the region were aware of this. We did collect oral histories and memorabilia that were eventually used in the exhibit. The steering committee also sponsored a contest for the design of a logo for the project. This contest was advertised through the local high school and college systems, and the response was very good. The African American Museum exhibited the artwork, and local newspapers announced the event and the eventual winner. The development of an educational curriculum, a city within a city, for third grade students was designed to provide students with specific information about the contribution of African Americans to the development of Dallas, while simultaneously encouraging an appreciation for people of all cultures and demonstrating to students the research methods for collecting cultural and historical data. The African American Museum uses the curriculum within its educational outreach program. A brochure and a poster were also developed to raise public awareness of the project and the public exhibit. Their distribution, however, was limited primarily to visitors of the African American Museum. Today, they would be distributed through the internet, and you would reach a much broader audience. Of course, the primary means of public outreach was the development of an exhibit that would convey the story of Freedman's Town to the public. The primary designers of the exhibit were Dr. Alan Governor and Philip Collins, an art curator at the museum. Consequently, the exhibit reflected the perspective of an art curator rather than that of an anthropologist. However, the interactive kiosk stationed throughout the exhibit conveyed the story of Freedman's Town and the task of moving the cemetery. Personally, I was slightly disappointed at the time, for I wanted to convey more information to the public and have a less curio cabinet approach. In hindsight, however, Dr. Governor and Philip Collins were spot on, for they created scenes or venues that evoke vivid memories, both pleasant and unpleasant, for the descendant community. The interactive kiosk fortunately provided the story and the narrative necessary to educate the public at large about a city within a city during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The end result of these efforts was a descendant community that was very pleased with how the team had conveyed the story of Freedman's town and the burial site of many of its residents. Public involvement in the developmental process, however, was limited primarily to the educated and elite of the African American community due to the means of outreach and the time required for involvement. Today, the use of social media and a dedicated website would broaden the audience who could participate and would expand the information provided by the local community. Our use of technology at the time was limited to the interactive kiosks and sound cones at selected stations within the exhibit. Exhibit technology today would aid in the immersion of the museum visitor in the story. The static display of the fresh gravesite within the cemetery can be replaced today by a three-dimensional image with associated video and sound to recreate the experience of being present at the burial ceremony. Technology, however, is not the key to success for public involvement. Technology enhances our ability to facilitate public involvement. It is a tool, albeit a very effective one. The key to success in 2000 and yet today lies within the people managing the project and public involvement. Prior to 2000, the scientists working on the Freedman Cemetery project felt that they owned the data and were largely ignoring the local community, which had a vested interest in the results. True public involvement requires scientists who are able to leave their egos at the door, are open to the perspectives of the local community, and can work collaboratively with the local community. My personal experience over the last 40 years is that the local community often has a perspective that we as scientists do not have. As scientists, we've not always respected the local community perspective. I believe that's changing, and I know not all my colleagues will agree with this perspective, but there are times when the values and interests of the descendant community really trump the interest of the scientists leading the study. I think it's on the responsibility for demonstrating to the local community the value of what we as archaeologists or human osteologists can contribute. That responsibility is on us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dwayne, for that great presentation on the Freedman Cemetery up in Dallas. If we can get Mr. Peters' video up for real quick, maybe he's actually visible. Dwayne, real quick question. So, you know, at the end of your video, you stressed the importance of collaborating with the local community. And I think as an archaeologist, that in some ways can be, you know, easier said than done. And I think it's, and one important aspect of this is the collaboration can be from a scientific perspective or more of just a contextual perspective of getting, you know, relying on additional resources. But I have always been intrigued and liked the idea of actually going to the community to get research questions and to kind of have ways to sort of steer the investigations and the research. And so I was wondering, with that Freedman Cemetery project, did you do any of that where they actually contributed to the analysis and the research itself and maybe the questions that you were asking of the data? Or was it more in that other category where it was more of a to provide context and understanding of these resources in ways that you didn't know beforehand?
Well, Mason, I think it's a combination of the two. You know, on both sides of that situation. frequently, they were helping provide context. Some of the members of our steering committee were were descendants of the Freedmanstown. But they also, they were also providing some direction as far as, what they wanted to see as the result of the study. They had been very vocal in opposition to the previous investigators, especially about the human remains and how they were going to be handled or analyzed. So there was, our focus was really more about, although we synthesized the human osteological data, the focus was on creating a story about Freedmanstown and what it meant to be a part of Freedmanstown. And for me personally, that was a great experience because growing up in northern Iowa, I didn't have much concept of African-American communities in an urban context. And it was an eye-opener to me about life for an African-American population in Dallas in the late 19th, early 20th century. I think it's an amazing story.
It really is. It really is. Well, thank you, Dwayne. We're going to go to the larger group, but first I did want to go back and talk to Doug Boyd about his Pioneer Cemetery investigation that was we showed a little bit earlier. So Doug, you're up there.
Here.
Hello.
Hello.
You didn't know that Dwayne did such a good impression of you, did you?
I didn't.
Well, so in your presentation, one of the things that I noticed was the use of the large excavation equipment, the gradles. And I think we in archaeology have seen those and we see them used on occasion, but they can seem very large and very potentially damaging for cemetery excavation. So why, as an archaeologist, did you elect to use that type of equipment on that investigation?
Well, that's a great question. And first, at Pioneer Cemetery, it would have been totally impractical to use strictly hand excavations to look for graves. The graves were too deep and the search area was huge. It was, almost an acre in size. So the machines, there was no other way to do it in a cost-effective manner. Second point I want to make, and I do want to be very clear about this, if heavy machinery is used properly, it does not damage the graves. It can and is used in archaeological excavations very effectively in many, many cases. I've used it on many projects myself. The three keys to doing good machine work and making it effective are: one, having a good machine operator. Got to have somebody who knows what they're doing with their machine, and they literally can slow down to a crawl and strip off 1 or 2 inches at a time. You have to have experienced archaeologists who know what to look for in the sediments and the soils, and go very slowly and monitor closely. And they have to focus on finding the grave shaft fill, not digging down fast to get down to where they think the bottom of the grave is, but looking for those subtle soil changes in the upper fill of the grave shaft that will indicate it, and then stop once you find the grave shaft and switch to hand excavations.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification on that. I guess let's go ahead and if we can bring up everybody on the screen now. I guess everybody might be up already. I know we have just a little bit of time left. I'm going to check. Yes, we've got just a little bit. I guess archaeologists, I like to think of it that we kind of give history some kind of mass. And I think that that mass is the physical remnants of our history and our heritage. And, cemeteries are a pretty substantial component of culture and life, because it's something that our culture surrounds these sorts of ceremonial events. And I also think that they're a reflection of how we treat those who come before us. And so, you know, one of the things that there's certainly a prevailing theme in a lot of the discussions, and including the Oakwood Cemetery project, where these are public development projects that seem to uncover unmarked graves fairly often. And I want to get the group's take on why that might be. Is it, you know, something that was intentional back, you know, decades or centuries ago, or is it something that was just these cemeteries were completely unknown or just unanticipated, or is it just some combination of all of the two, I suppose? So I'll open that up first. Let's ask Doug, and then we can kind of spread out from there.
I think it's very easy historically for cemeteries of minority groups and poor people to get left behind, because entire communities were displaced. They were removed from their homes, whether forcibly, but they were taken away and go to new areas, and their cemeteries are lost and forgotten. So let's take one example, and that's the Great Migration, which is when millions of African Americans in the United States moved in the late 19th and early 20th century. They generally moved from rural areas in the South to urban areas, and then moved to cities in the North. And they were leaving behind their entire lives and the places that they were familiar with, including their cemeteries. And they were really didn't want to leave their homes, but it was a forced migration by the dire circumstances they found themselves in. They were facing racism and lack of economic opportunity in the Jim Crow South. So that Great Migration happened, and just think for a moment, what happened to those cemeteries when they left? There was no one left to protect them. The white people in the area weren't inclined to care for the black cemeteries. And over time, those cemeteries get swallowed up by vegetation, headstones get knocked over and broken, the wooden markers simply deteriorate, and people can come along and look at that land and say, well, we could use that for something productive. And so that's how I think a lot of cemeteries were never intentionally neglected, but they were neglected out of the facts of historical racism and migrations of people, and they do get lost in time and space, and a cemetery can be lost in a single generation, can be totally forgotten, and we've seen examples of that. So
Sergio, would you have any insights on that?
Yes, actually, on some of my, when I worked with the Texas Historical Commission, some of the reviews that I did that involved African-American burial grounds as well as Mexican-American burial grounds, a lot of times the perception that the cemeteries were forgotten is on one side of the spectrum, and finding out some of the lineal descendant groups, such as Dr. Fred McGee's and other groups, they are very well aware of them and have, in some cases, documented names of people interred at certain cemeteries. And it's very important at the very beginning of projects to coordinate with individuals that know some of the history about their own culture. But in general, the great majority of the early 1800s burial grounds were completely segregated. And so as time went on, the roads that were small little county roads, when they were expanded, the road was expanded in the area of the segregated cemetery. And so that's why a lot of times TxDOT will find many of these, because the highway now, the major highways, were once old county roads. One of the best ways to find that any researcher beginning a project can begin to look is in the 1936 county highway maps, because those maps will actually show the segregated areas and give you a clue as to whether or not there might be something there. Other than that, that's the quickest thing in terms of a background review. Other than that, it depends on the level of archival research. looking at the earliest historic land grants and seeing if there were any particular graveyards within a particular area of the land tract, because in the early 1800s, middle 1800s, people, families would just bury their relatives in a particular area, typically along the boundary line of their land.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually ordinances were passed where you had to bury individuals not on your land, but in a burial ground area. And then eventually, late 1800s, early 1900s, people had to be buried out of town. But the issue with that was cities grew so big that they enveloped those places that used to be out of town. So it's just understanding the history and evolution of cemetery practices and mortuary practices.
I guess the San Jose Burial Park in San Antonio is a good example of one of those where they, during that early 20th century, they needed to set up a burial ground or a cemetery outside of the city of San Antonio. And now the city has completely grown up around it. That's in the south side, kind of near a lot of the missions and things like that. So I guess, thank you very much for the, I guess, a question for Dwayne. So the examples of the projects that we've talked about here, these are all from cultural resource management, archaeological excavations. And so, all of us who are here on this panel are professionals in private archaeological investigations, largely for, this is our profession. And a lot of times public agencies pay companies like ours to do archaeological investigations. And, you know, I think that there's been discussion of that there are two types of clients in projects for cultural resource management. There's the business client, and then there's the ethical client that come with it. And so the business client is essentially in most instances, it's the agency that is obligated to do these investigations, and they are the ones who are paying for the work that's being done under the law. But they also have very finite resources that they're working with. Now, at the same time, you have ethical clients, what they're called, and this is, you know, this is something that's been discussed by other researchers, and these are the affected communities. These are members of the affected communities who are they have a stake in these resources, especially like these cemeteries, descendant groups and things like that. And so as cultural resource managers, we're in many respects, we're being paid by our business clients, but we also want to effectively represent the ethical clients as well. And so I wanted to get, starting with Dwayne here, kind of your take on how do you, and it's not necessarily that they're always, you know, these two clients have disparate opinions of how things should proceed, but they're going to be approaching these situations from a different perspective. And so I'd like to get, Dwayne, your take on how you sort of navigate that process.
Well, admittedly, it can be a challenge because your client doesn't necessarily have the same values as the descendant community or the ethical client that community you're dealing with. I guess my personal experience, personal and professional experience, is that I try very hard to bring the two parties to a consensus of how you move forward. You know, I've always, as a consultant, I've always felt that you present the best path forward to your client, and sometimes the client is resistant to that path, but you know, in the end, it's the client's decision about how everything's going to move forward. But you know, my experience dealing with the client and the local community is that you basically end up playing the middleman, trying to bring the two together to a reasonable solution. And you know, most times that does work. You know, I've had clients that dealing with cemeteries that I've had to point out to them that you know, think about this cemetery if your grandparents are there. And that approach sometimes works with people, because when they think about if it was their family, their ancestors in that cemetery, what would they do? I had one case in north central Texas where the developer was adamant that he was moving forward and moving burials. After we opened up the first burial, he shut us down and decided he would avoid the cemetery. Once he saw the reality of what it meant to, you know, dig up human remains, it hit him that, you know, it really wasn't the best idea that we moved, you know, he had other options. So to me, it's, you know, as a consultant, you end up being in the middle in these situations. Sometimes it's easy, other times it's not so easy, it's very challenging. But, you know, my perspective was always trying to convince the client to do the right thing, but given that situation and the desires of the community.
And I think it's just to add to that, Dwayne, you know, one other part of this I think that's important to remember is I would certainly, and I'm sure you would probably agree with this, that a lot of times these agencies, they're not out to pull something over on these groups. It's more a matter of there's a degree of inertia, and there is also a degree of they have very fixed and finite resources and constraints that they're working within. Right. And so that is a real challenge of just trying to figure out how to make something work within these challenging, especially with cemetery projects. These can be very emotional and very emotionally closely held sites and centers for these communities. And so the opinions can become very closely held. Doug, do you have anything you can kind of add on that at all?
Yeah, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that every once in a while, you know, when we're trying to convince clients to do a cemetery, treat it the right way and do all the right things, it may be more expensive for them and they may be balking at that. But sometimes we have to play the PR card, and that is to convince them that bad public relations would be something that would be disastrous for them, and that the best way to avoid that is to do it the right way up front and go through all the right steps, do the community outreach and bring everybody in. And you know, Dwayne's right, it doesn't always work, but sometimes we have to do whatever we can to try and educate the clients and get them to do the right thing.
Right. Sergio, did you have anything on that or
Well, in general, the law is very specific. The health and safety code. You can't build on top of a cemetery, and you need written consent from the next of kin to be able to remove the human remains. And so, in many cases, you know, the cases that we got to see from Dwayne and Doug, that's where there is consensus. When there isn't consensus, then it winds up going to court, and then the court will explain it to the project sponsor that they're just not going to be able to do what they wanted to do with the land that they bought. And, you know, it's very similar to a phase 1 environmental site assessment. When someone is going to buy the land, they do that sort of assessment to see if there's old oil tanks that are leaking, because they're just going to avoid buying that property. And we've always recommended to our clients that they also do at least a background review, just to make sure that there isn't somewhere in the record that there's an old burial ground there or a Native American burial ground. So at least they have that to take into consideration in their overall planning process.
Excellent. Yeah, because with those situations, when you're purchasing that land, you're buying everything that goes with it. I mean, there are some legal exceptions for cemeteries and burial grounds, but the responsibility certainly becomes yours. I guess I wanted to, I guess, see if there were any questions from the attendees, and I didn't want to run out of time. We have about 5 minutes left. And if there were none, then I have a couple more that I can ask, but I thought I'd just go ahead and make sure first.
Please go ahead, Mason.
What?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead with your last questions. Yeah.
All right. I get to talk some more. Great. So I guess, you know, one of the things that I think is kind of an interesting aspect of this is, especially when you are working with often minority groups or marginalized communities and cemeteries and archaeological sites that are related to those, you know, we learn a great deal from doing excavations at cemeteries. But I think one part of this is, you know, what about that community and we can speak in very broad general terms, do cemeteries teach us as archaeologists, but also what don't they teach us about these communities? So, and I'm going to open this up for anybody who wants to jump in.
Well, I'll go ahead and add that one of the things that it does teach us is the concept of family burial plots, and that those may not be completely in the alignments and rows the way that we're used to seeing cemeteries today. And so when we're excavating, the way Doug was saying, with a grade awl very carefully, looking for a burial shaft, and then once you see that, stopping, noticing the difference. Just because there isn't one 3 to 4 feet away, a burial shaft 3 to 4 feet away, it doesn't mean that there are no more burials. So it depends on what type of cultural background that cemetery is related to, because those family plot areas will be grouped together with some distance in between those groups. I'm speaking specifically about Mexican-American burial grounds, Hispanic and Tejano burial grounds.
Of course. Dwayne or Doug, do y'all have anything on that about like when we archaeologists learn something about these communities by doing excavations at cemeteries, you know, what are the glimpses of their lives that we don't really see when we look at these places?
Well, I think burials are, you know, just the holistic picture. If you look at most of what we do as archaeologists, we're dealing with the mundane daily life materials that we find in home sites or campsites and things like that. And the burials give us that glimpse into the spiritual and the religious and beliefs that you cannot really get any other way. So, you know, cemeteries are complementary. They are another part of the aspect of the every culture that's out there. So comparing and contrasting our daily life and our subsistence is the same as looking at mortuary traits from culture to culture. And it's, if you want to get the whole story, you've got to look at the big picture.
These are all little puzzle pieces that come together to tell us the whole story, in other words. Yeah.
All right. Well, our time has come to an end, and I want to thank all of you. I know I learned a lot. We're so very pleased that you could join us all together here. We're going to be taking a short break and returning at 7 o'clock for our next panel, Understanding Our Ancestors Through Anthropology. This is a discussion about genetic anthropology and the study of ancient DNA analysis, led by moderator Kim McKnight. Thank you, and we'll see you at 7.